The wind howled fiercely, sharp, bringing with it snow so thick it seemed endless. The small cabin in the heart of the mountains had been a refuge for a group of friends who, over the years, had always gathered for expeditions. Life had drifted them apart with daily responsibilities and commitments, but that trip was a chance to reminisce about old times, to reconnect. They had no idea that, this year, winter would bring a challenge far greater than anything they had faced before. Sarah, a woman in her 30s, was the group's unofficial leader. Brave and determined, she was always the one to keep everyone in check. With her practical nature and huge heart, Sarah was the glue that held the friends together. Beside her was Tom, her childhood friend, always ready for adventure but also known for being the most anxious of the group. His humor often helped to lighten the tension. Completing the group were Rachel and Lucas, a newlywed couple who saw the adventure as a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. And, of course, there was Nick, the quietest of them all, who always seemed to be contemplating something deeper, something beyond the mountains and the snowy landscape. They had started their journey with enthusiasm, excited for the chance to explore new trails and disconnect from the world. But when the snowstorm started falling relentlessly, they realized they were facing something far beyond their control. What was supposed to be a peaceful hike through the mountains quickly turned into a nightmare. Visibility was practically zero, and the temperature dropped with every passing minute. Their maps and compasses became useless in the dense snow, and they soon realized they were completely lost. The radio they carried was silent, with no signal. Fear began to spread, initially quietly, but now palpable on each face. Sarah tried to stay calm. "We'll find shelter," she repeated, more to herself than to the others. But with every step they took, it became clear they had no idea where they were going. They were trapped in the middle of a vast white expanse, with no end in sight. The sun was beginning to set, and with it, the cold became even more unbearable. The wind lashed their faces, and despair began to settle in. "We can't keep going like this," Lucas said, his voice trembling with both cold and fear. "We have to find somewhere to take shelter." Rachel, though trying to stay calm, was visibly shaken. Her eyes welled up with tears of fear and exhaustion. Every minute, hope seemed to slip further away. They were alone, isolated from everything and everyone, in a place where nature showed no mercy. Nick, always quiet, now began to show signs of desperation. He felt the shortness of breath caused by both the altitude and the growing panic. Sarah knew they couldn't keep going much longer. If they didn't find shelter, the night could be fatal. "Let's keep walking, just a little further," Sarah said, trying to keep hope alive. But as night fell, the path became increasingly difficult. The group's strength was fading, and the cold was already beginning to penetrate their bones. The idea of stopping and resting seemed tempting, but Sarah knew that if they stopped now, they might never get up again. When they were on the verge of total exhaustion, something unexpected happened. In the midst of the vast white expanse and the silence of the snowstorm, they heard a sound. A bark. Everyone froze, their hearts pounding. It couldn't be. Were they imagining things? But the sound repeated, louder this time. And then, as if materializing out of nowhere, a silhouette appeared in the distance. A robust figure, covered in thick fur as white as the snow around it. A husky. Its bright eyes reflected the faint light left from the setting sun, and its posture was determined. It wasn't there by accident. The group stood still, unsure of what to think. How had a dog appeared in the middle of such a storm? Where had it come from? And more importantly, what did it want? The husky walked toward them, its gaze fixed as if it knew exactly what it was doing. The animal stopped in front of Sarah, looked directly into her eyes, and let out a soft bark, as if saying, "Come with me." Tom, the first to break the silence, murmured, "Is it possible that he's trying to help us?" Sarah, still stunned, knelt down and extended her hand to the dog. He approached and gently brushed his head against her hand. That simple gesture brought an unexpected warmth to her heart. There was something more about that dog. Something none of them could explain, but that somehow made them believe he was the key to their survival. The husky looked back, as if signaling for them to follow. They were out of options, without direction, and exhaustion was beginning to overwhelm them. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision. "Let's follow him," she said, her voice now carrying a new hope. That mysterious husky had appeared from nowhere, but at that moment, he was the only thing connecting them to the hope of survival. They had no idea where he would lead them, but together, they began to follow his firm steps through the snow. The husky moved forward with an inexplicable confidence, his steps firm and determined through the thick snow. It was as if he knew every detail of that treacherous terrain, while the friends struggled to keep their balance and continue following him. The wind didn't seem to bother him, and his thick fur looked like a natural armor against the relentless storm. Each movement was graceful and powerful, leaving a trail of paw prints that quickly disappeared under the falling snow. Sarah led the group, her eyes fixed on the dog walking ahead. She felt the weight of responsibility for her friends and knew that, at that moment, their fate depended on that mysterious husky. The group was exhausted, but something about the animal's presence gave them the strength to carry on, even when their bodies begged for rest. Time seemed to drag on. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and night was falling deeper, making the darkness almost impenetrable. The conditions were extreme, and Sarah could feel the growing fatigue in her legs, but she refused to stop. They were clinging to the only chance they had of survival. "Do you think he knows where he's going?" Tom asked, his voice trembling with both cold and exhaustion. Sarah glanced at her friend, her eyes tired but with a glimmer of hope that had disappeared until now. "I'm not sure, but he seems determined. We have to trust him." Rachel, visibly shaken, clung to Lucas's hand as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "What if he's leading us further away?" she whispered, her voice full of fear. "What if he's taking us to more danger?" Lucas hugged her, trying to offer comfort, but he too was shaken. "We don't have any other choice," he replied softly. "We have to trust his instincts. There's nothing else we can do." The group continued following the husky in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Emotions were running high. The cold was beginning to seep not just into their bodies but into their minds as well. Despair, which had initially been just a shadow, now loomed larger. What if they didn't find shelter? What if the dog, no matter how well-intentioned, wasn't leading them anywhere? Nick, who had remained silent most of the time, finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "This reminds me, once, when I was a child, I got lost in the woods. I was terrified, but suddenly, a dog appeared and guided me back home. I never knew where he came from. It was like he was just there to save me." Everyone looked at Nick, surprised by his words. He rarely shared anything personal, but in that moment, his story seemed to bring a strange comfort. It was as if that husky was a sign that, even in the midst of chaos, there was a greater force, something beyond human understanding, watching over them. Maybe we're meant to follow this dog," Nick continued, his voice stronger now. "Maybe he's our only chance." The group absorbed his words in silence, and as irrational as it might seem, they felt Nick was right. Something about that husky exuded a sense of purpose, as if he was there to be more than just a guide. He was a symbol of hope, of something greater than they could comprehend. Hours passed. Exhaustion and cold were taking a relentless toll on their bodies. Sarah looked up at the sky, searching for stars or any sign that the storm might end, but all she could see was an endless white veil. The snow wasn't stopping, and their strength was on the verge of depletion. Then, suddenly, the husky stopped. He looked back, making sure they were still following. His eyes, so deep and intense, seemed to glow in the darkness. He took a few more steps and stopped in front of something the group hadn't noticed until that moment, a cave, semi-hidden by the snow. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her body. They had found shelter. "He brought us here," Tom said, almost in disbelief. "This dog really saved us." With the last bit of strength they had left, the group entered the cave. It was small, but enough to protect them from the raging storm. Inside, the wind was just a distant murmur, and the feeling of safety finally enveloped them. The husky entered right behind them, sitting at the cave's entrance like a silent guardian. His eyes watched the storm outside, but he seemed calm, as if he knew he had fulfilled his role. Rachel, still trembling, looked at the dog with tears in her eyes. "How is this possible? He knew exactly where to take us." Sarah, though equally perplexed, felt something deeper. "He was sent to us," she murmured, not daring to say more. As the storm continued outside, the group huddled together in the relative warmth of the cave, and the husky, the unexpected hero, remained vigilant, never taking his eyes off the darkness. The group, now safe inside the cave, began to feel the weight of everything they had faced in the past few hours. The intense cold and the desperation that had accompanied them out in the vast white expanse had transformed into a quiet unease. Although protected from the storm, they were still isolated and far from any sign of civilization. Exhaustion was evident in each of them, but there was also a sense of gratitude hanging in the air, a mixture of relief and astonishment for what had just happened. The husky sat at the entrance of the cave, his eyes fixed on the snow still falling outside, as if he were waiting for something. He didn't seem to rest, always alert, as if he knew his job was not yet done. Sarah approached the dog, kneeling beside him. There was something almost supernatural about his presence. She ran her hand over the husky's head, who tilted his snout slightly, accepting the affection. There was an inexplicable connection between them, as if the animal had been sent by a greater force to be there at that exact moment. "You saved us, boy," she whispered, feeling a lump in her throat. The husky looked at her, his eyes shining with silent wisdom. It was as if he understood. Tom, sitting further back in the cave, still couldn't process what had happened. "This is surreal." His voice was a mix of disbelief and relief. How did he know? How did this dog appear right at the right moment? And why did he guide us here? Rachel, who was still shivering from the cold despite the shelter the cave offered, shook her head, trying to process the situation. It doesn't make sense, and at the same time, it feels like it had to be this way. She hesitated, unsure how to finish the sentence. Lucas completed his wife's thought, his voice soft but firm. "Like he was sent for us." Nick, who had been quietly observing everything, took a deep breath before speaking, his voice heavy with emotion. "There are things we can't explain. Maybe we'll never know where he came from or why he showed up. But," he paused, looking at the husky, who was still standing guard at the entrance, "what matters is that he's here. And he saved us." The group remained silent for a moment, each reflecting on the situation. The cold still cut through their bodies, but the cave provided the protection they so desperately needed. However, they knew they still weren't completely safe. The storm outside was still fierce, and with no communication equipment working, they remained isolated. "We need a plan," said Sarah, breaking the silence. "We can't just sit here waiting for the storm to pass. We need to figure out how to get out of here and back to civilization." Tom shook his head, exhausted. "But how, Sarah? We're in the middle of nowhere, with no idea where we are. If we leave now, it could be even more dangerous." Rachel, still holding Lucas's hand, seemed apprehensive. What if the dog knows the way back too? The idea sounded absurd, but after what they had been through, any possibility seemed plausible. "It might be our only hope," Nick replied, his eyes fixed on the husky. "He brought us here. Maybe he can take us home too." Sarah nodded slowly, but there was a concern in her eyes. "We can't just depend on that. We need to be prepared in case something goes wrong." Lucas agreed. "I agree, but I think it's worth trusting him. He brought us here when we were on the brink of giving up. Maybe he really knows what he's doing." As they discussed, the husky suddenly stood up, his fur bristling. His behavior changed suddenly. He began sniffing the air and growling softly, as if warning them of something. The group immediately went on alert. Something was wrong. Sarah stood up and looked outside the cave, but all she could see was the dense snow falling. The wind howled fiercely, but there were no visible signs of danger. What could he be sensing? Tom asked, worried. Suddenly, a distant sound echoed through the mountains. A metallic noise, something that didn't belong in the natural environment around them. The husky began barking intensely, as if trying to draw attention to the sound. Could that be a chance for rescue? Rachel asked, hopeful. The noise grew louder, and now everyone could hear it. It sounded like the hum of a machine, something approaching. It could be a rescue vehicle or perhaps another group of lost people. "We need to find out what it is," Sarah said, already determined. "But we should be cautious. The husky is warning us about something." With the sound growing closer and the husky's behavior indicating that something big was about to happen, the group knew that this was the moment to act. The sound became clearer with each passing second, and the group, driven by adrenaline and uncertainty, gathered at the entrance of the cave with the husky in the lead. The animal, now visibly restless, kept barking toward the noise, as if trying to alert them to something. Sarah watched carefully, trying to make sense of what was happening. They were in such a remote place that the chance of anyone being nearby seemed almost impossible. Yet, the sound of clanking metal echoed through the mountains, heightening their hopes and fears at the same time. "Let's go," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We have to see what it is. But please, everyone be cautious. We don't know what we'll find." Tom hesitated for a moment, but seeing Sarah's determination and the husky's silent confidence, he nodded and began following her steps. The group prepared to face the cold once again, wrapped in layers of clothing, as the storm outside still roared with intensity. The husky, always in front, led them through the thick snow. His ears were perked up, and he sniffed the air with every step. There was a strange confidence in the dog's movements, as if he knew he was on the right path. The trek through the snow was exhausting, and visibility was still almost non-existent. Every step felt like a monumental effort. Yet, driven by a combination of desperation and hope, they followed the husky, who kept barking from time to time, as if maintaining the rhythm and encouraging them not to stop. Finally, the group reached a more open area where the sound seemed louder and clearer. They stopped abruptly, trying to figure out where it was coming from. In the distance, they saw something that left them astonished: blinking lights moving toward them. They were faint, but they were definitely lights from some sort of vehicle. "A rescue," Rachel murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. Before they could react, the husky started running toward the lights, leaving behind any hesitation. Sarah, driven by an instinct of trust, followed the dog. The rest of the group soon followed, feeling the same mix of hope and disbelief. Could it be that, after everything they had been through, they were so close to being saved? As they ran toward the lights, the silhouettes of two large vehicles began to take shape in the storm. They were mountain rescue machines, with powerful headlights cutting through the darkness and fog. The sight was almost surreal for the group, who had spent hours in despair, with no idea how they would survive. The sound they had heard earlier was the heavy engines, now approaching them. The group paused for a moment, unable to believe what they were seeing. Relief washed over them, and tears began to well up in each of their eyes. The husky, who had run ahead, stood next to the vehicles, looking back as if to ensure they arrived safely. Two men got out of the vehicles, and upon seeing the group, waved frantically. They were well wrapped in warm clothing, carrying radios and flashlights. One of the men, clearly surprised to see the group, ran over to them and began speaking loudly to be heard over the wind. "Are you all okay? We thought no one would still be alive in this area," the man said, while the other member of the team approached. Sarah, breathless and still in disbelief, replied with a weak but grateful voice, "We're alive, thanks to him." And she pointed to the husky, who was calmly sitting by the rescue vehicles. The men looked at the dog, surprised. "This dog?" one of them asked, clearly confused. "He's part of our team, but he disappeared yesterday. We were looking for him too." The group exchanged glances, shocked. The husky had found them, lost in the storm, and guided them back to his rescue team. He wasn't just an unlikely guide. He was the hero who had saved them from what seemed like an impossible situation. The dog, without any fanfare, wagged his tail slightly, as if knowing he had completed his mission. Sarah, tears filling her eyes, knelt down to pet him. "You saved our lives," she repeated, her voice trembling with emotion. The group was helped by the rescue team, who led them into the heated vehicles, offering blankets and supplies. Rachel, still in disbelief, hugged Lucas tightly, feeling the weight of tension finally lift. "I don't know how to thank you," she murmured, as a wave of relief washed over her body. Lucas, his voice breaking, responded, "I think we owe our lives to him." The group was safe, and the heroism of the husky would not go unnoticed. The dog, in his silent determination, had not only guided them through the storm but had also led them back to life. The warmth inside the rescue vehicles was an immediate relief. The exhaustion that had kept them tense before now began to melt away as they settled into the cushioned seats. Wrapped in thermal blankets, the group was still processing everything that had happened. The husky, their unexpected savior, sat beside Sarah, his head resting on her lap, as if he could finally relax after fulfilling his crucial role. The vehicle's engine roared, and the headlights illuminated the path through the storm. It was an almost surreal sight for Sarah, who leaned against the window, watching the snow still falling heavily. She knew that if it weren't for the husky, they never would have survived that night. There was no doubt that the dog had been a miracle wrapped in white fur and bright, shining eyes. "This dog is truly incredible," one of the rescuers said, looking at the husky with admiration. "I've never seen anything like this. He was missing, and somehow he found you and led us back to you." Tom, now more relaxed, shook his head in disbelief. "I'm not a religious man, but that was a miracle. He appeared out of nowhere and saved us when we were on the verge of giving up." Rachel, still holding Lucas's hand, wiped away a tear that escaped her eyes. "I've never felt so helpless as I did in that storm. But this dog—" She looked at the husky with eyes full of gratitude. "He gave us hope when there was none left." Nick, always the quietest and most introspective of the group, finally spoke with a serenity that resonated in the vehicle. "Sometimes, we find ourselves in situations that seem impossible, where everything feels lost. And then, something or someone shows up to remind us that there's still a chance. Whatever brought this dog to us was more than just luck." The husky looked at Nick for a brief moment, as if he understood perfectly what was being said, then returned to resting, his eyes peaceful and his posture calm. The group traveled in silence for a while, each one processing the experience in their own way. Sarah, however, couldn't stop thinking about what it all meant. In those hours of despair, she had felt the weight of responsibility for her friends in a way she had never experienced before. And it was in that moment of total vulnerability that the husky appeared, like a silent answer to a prayer she didn't even know she had made. When they finally arrived at the rescue station, they were greeted by a medical team who quickly assessed them for signs of hypothermia and exhaustion. Fortunately, though physically and emotionally worn out, they were all in good condition. The relief in the air was palpable, and worried expressions began to be replaced by relieved smiles. As the rescuers cared for the group, Sarah couldn't help but watch the husky, who remained by her side, as faithful as ever. She knew that without him, this story would have had a very different ending. The dog, who had been an almost divine apparition at their most critical moment, had now become an indelible part of their lives. "So, what happens to him now?" Sarah asked one of the rescuers, stroking the husky's ears. The man smiled. "He's part of our team, but it looks like he's found a new group to look after." He glanced at the dog with admiration. "He's special, no doubt about it." Sarah smiled and knelt down to be eye to eye with the husky. "You saved our lives. I don't know how we can ever thank you." The husky, as if understanding her words, gently licked her hand. In that moment, no more words were needed. The bond between them was clear and deep. The dog had become not just the hero of the story, but a symbol of hope, faith, and resilience. He appeared when despair was at its highest and brought with him the courage they needed to keep going. As the group prepared to leave the rescue station, the husky stood at the entrance, watching the snowy horizon that still covered the mountains. It was as if he was waiting for his next mission, the next group of people he could help. He wasn't just a lost dog, he was a guardian of the mountains, a silent protector who showed up when most needed. When the group finally boarded the vehicle that would take them back to civilization, Sarah looked one last time at the husky, who stood watching them from a distance. She felt a deep connection with the animal, a silent recognition that, in some way, he had changed their lives forever. "I'll never forget you," she whispered, as the vehicle started moving, leaving behind the snowy mountains and the husky who inhabited them. As the vehicle pulled away, the group remained silent, reflecting on what had happened. Nick's words echoed in Sarah's mind. Sometimes, in our lives, something or someone appears when we need them the most, even when we've lost all hope. The husky had been that someone, and forever, he would be remembered as the savior who appeared in the middle of a storm when everything seemed lost. The group story was not just one of survival, but a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, there is always light, and sometimes, that light comes in the form of an unexpected friend with four paws and a heart full of courage.